Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream of History Valley podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Helen Bond, and today's topic is going to be based upon our book titled Caiaphas, Friend of Rome and Judge of Jesus. The link to purchase the book will be in the Amazon History Valley affiliate link in the description below. And with that being said, welcome back to History Valley podcast, Professor Bond.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
And before we continue, I want to mention that Professor Bond has a podcast called Biblical Time Machine. Can you tell us what that podcast is about, please?
Well, we have a real time machine, and together with journalist Dave Roos, who works for the Stuff You Should Know sort of media empire, we get in our time machine and we journey back in time to the biblical period. So anything from sort of 8th century BCE to 1st or 2nd century CE. And we look at any topic to do with the Bible. We look at what did Jesus look like? What were toilets like at the time? What do we know about the 12 tribes? Were there really 12 tribes? How did Yahweh get to be Israel's God? Lots and lots of topics that you wouldn't even know were topics that we address on our podcast. And each one's just 40 minutes. So yeah, come and have a look at what we're doing.
So what do we know about Caiaphas, the high priest?
Not as much as we would like. That's the problem. He's a shadowy character. So we can tell from Josephus that he was high priest from roughly 19 to 37 CE. So he's the longest serving high priest of the 1st century. Some of them only lasted a year or so. So he would have given a certain stability to the role, that's for sure. He also his dates completely coincide with and on either side with Pilate. So he was already high priest when Pilate came. Pilate was presumably happy enough to keep him in office, or maybe Pilate didn't actually have the right to change the high priest. But the two men worked together throughout the whole of Pilate's governorship. And then Caiaphas was got rid of 3 months or so after Pilate had also been deposed. And both of them lost their post to the legate of Syria. There's probably some kind of story there as to why Caiaphas lost his role so closely after Pilate, but we just don't know. Presumably the two men worked together quite well. I mean, that's a long time, 11 years they would have been working together. So presumably they kind of knew how to do business and to work with one another. We also know that Caiaphas married into the very prestigious high priestly family of Annas, as he's known in the New Testament, or Ananus I, as he's known in Josephus. And this guy was sort of like the most important head of a high priestly clan in the 1st century. And his family had a stranglehold over the high priesthood in the first phase of direct Roman rule. So we're talking kind of 6 CE to the 40s. That's sort of the time when the Annas family is very much in control of the high priesthood. And besides that, all we know about him really is what we know about any high priest. So we know, for example, that he would have been in charge of this vast temple complex, that he was ultimately in charge of all the sacrifices, and that he was seen as the mediator between people and God, particularly on the Day of Atonement, when he was the only one who was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies and pray for the people. There's also a kind of a political role to his work as well. And you have to be a little bit careful about sort of separating religion and politics in the 1st century. It's all sort of completely intertwined. But insofar as you can, he was in charge of the day-to-day running of Jerusalem. The Romans really had a very, very small presence in Judea, and the Roman governor and his entourage were out in Caesarea on the seaside, so a good sort of 30 miles or so away from Jerusalem. And so sort of day-to-day running is left, as it always is by the Romans, in the hands of aristocrats, sort of local aristocrats. And in the case of Judea, it's these aristocratic priests who are in charge of things. So again, Caiaphas has to sort of keep the peace, maintain order. He's sort of the go-between between the governor on one side and the expectations of Rome, and the people, and what they're willing to tolerate on the other side. So it's quite a difficult sort of role. He's got to mediate, he's got to negotiate. This is all in the time of face-to-face negotiation, male honor and pride, and he's got quite a difficult tightrope to walk in all of that, I think. So I think that's probably his main job description, I suppose.
Is what the Gospels tell us about Caiaphas consistent with what Josephus tells us about him?
I think broadly, although the difficulty is that neither of them tell us all that much about him. So the little bits that we have in Josephus are easy enough to sort of fix together with the little bits that we have in the New Testament. I mean, I suppose the broad picture that we have in Josephus is that the high priest is in charge of day-to-day affairs in Jerusalem, and he'll summon sort of various people to help him with that. And if there's a troublemaker or some kind of an uprising, then it's probably going to be the high priest who lets Pilate know about that. So that sort of is broadly in line with what we have in the Gospels. I suppose one area that's a bit different is that it's very clear from Josephus that there was no sort of fixed council, a formal council in Judea. People have tended to think that there was, because the Mishnah, written sort of several centuries later, talks about a fixed council of 71 people. And that nowadays is seen as sort of wishful thinking on the part of the rabbis. It's clear from Josephus that there wasn't a fixed council, and that the high priest was top dog. He makes all the decisions. And he just gathers together a small group of sort of ad hoc friends and family, aristocrats, people who know something about a particular topic. He might sort of get them together and convene a very small meeting, but there's no need for this big council. That seems to be a later sort of dream of the rabbis, writing much later, once the temple and Jerusalem has actually fallen to the Romans. And so that kind of conflicts with what we have in the Gospels, where the Gospels again suggest that it's a more formal gathering. Mark talks about the elders of the people and the scribes and the chief priests. You get this impression it's a large representative body there. And I think probably the reason for that is that Mark is wanting to extend the blame here. It's not just the high priest and a few cronies who got together to do away with Jesus, but he wants to imply that it's a more representative group. And this, of course, is part of this early Christian thing to put more and more blame onto the Jewish people as a whole.
Can you tell us a bit about the Joseph bar Caiaphas ossuary?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, this is really interesting, because this is our one tangible link with the sort of enigmatic, rather shadowy high priest. At least it might be. So this was found in 1990 during sort of routine excavation work in the Peace Forest to the south of Jerusalem, in the Talpiot area. And a little sort of digger, I think, fell through what later proved to be a tomb. And I mean, this whole area is full of sort of limestone tombs. So, that in itself wasn't particularly surprising. But when the archaeologists got in and excavated it, I think they found something like sort of 6 ossuaries, or, these bone boxes that people used to put the bones of people in a year or so after death. And a couple of these had not been moved by grave robbers, and one of them has people used to sort of write on the side the name of the person. So this particular one it's quite a ornate box. It's got beautiful sort of circular rosettes on it, and the whole thing would have been painted a sort of reddish orange color. So, it's clearly the box of somebody of status. And then on the side, it says what appears to be Joseph bar Caiaphas, or Kofa, or Kapha. It's not very clear how we're supposed to read that. But this inscription, Joseph bar, son of Caiaphas, Kofa, Kapha, is very, very similar to what we have in Josephus, who talks about the high priest as Joseph called Caiaphas. So, is Caiaphas a nickname of some kind, or a family name? It's certainly very, very unusual. And so, although there have been some objections raised on various aspects of the tomb, is it grand enough? Is it how likely is it that Caiaphas would have used an ossuary, and various other things that people have queried about the ossuary? I think that on balance, it does seem to most people that it is either Caiaphas himself, or that it's a close member of his family. And the box itself had the remains in it of a man of about 60, which would be a pretty good age at the time, along with a younger woman and some remains of children. And that, again, is quite common in ossuaries. You often find the remains of several people. So maybe this was a wife or an older daughter and some children. So it's quite exciting to think that this could be, it's now in the Jerusalem Museum, where you can go and look at it. They have a kind of a corner there where they've got all the sort of New Testament stuff. So they have the Pilate stone, and they have the Caiaphas box, and they also have the ankle with the bone of the guy from Yehohanan, the guy who was crucified and clearly ended up getting buried as well. So it's this little sort of corner of New Testament related things, but it's quite exciting to go and see it.
Do you have a view of your own? Do you think this is really the ossuary of Caiaphas, or do you not, or are you unsure?
We can never be sure. I think it might be. Yeah, why not? One of the difficulty with the inscriptions, I think the main difficulty is the inscription. Is it actually Caiaphas, or is it Kapha or Kofa or something like that? One of the problems is that because literacy levels were so low, and ossuary inscriptions are full of mistakes, and this name Caiaphas is written in slightly different ways on the two different bone boxes. So we really can't be too sure about even what they were intending to write, let alone what they did write in the end. So I think there's a reasonable chance that it is his ossuary. It's clearly somebody of status. So why not?
Do we know which sect Caiaphas belonged to?
Not for sure, but it is likely that he was a Sadducee. I think, most of the Sadducees were from the aristocratic priesthood. So I think it's most likely that he was a Sadducee, though no text specifically says that. One of the big difficulties with the Sadducees is that everything we know about them comes from hostile outsiders who are all only too pleased to denigrate them. So Josephus, for example, tells us quite a few things about them, but he clearly doesn't like them very much. He says they're really rude and boorish to one another, and he says they're really harsh in judgment, and they don't believe in fate. You have free will, and it's up to you, what you do in this life. And the stranger thing maybe is that he says that they were only interested in the first 5 books of the scriptures, so the Pentateuch or the Torah. They were the only bits that they thought were authoritative, which is kind of strange because, nobody could live their lives in the 1st century just based on these texts that come from the 5th century or whatever BCE. So they must have had a lot of interpretations and lots of debates about how you interpret these texts and how you apply them to daily life. But none of their texts have survived. Maybe they only had oral texts, but they must also have had a lot of teachings about how you went around, how you went about sort of service in the temple. What are you doing? How are you organizing this all? How are you getting all the priests in? How are you deciding who's doing what? How are you casting lots? And there must have been a whole body of sort of Sadducean thought, whether it's written down or oral. And I'm sure if we had access to some of that, it would give you a completely different picture of what the Sadducees were like. I mean, when you think about it, if we only had writings about Christians from outsiders and hostile sources, we would never have any sense of the depth or sophistication of Christian thought. So it's very difficult, I think, to just take the word of hostile outsiders. But in this case, that's all we've got. We can maybe try and imagine that there was a more positive way of expressing your Sadducean identity. But some people have occasionally suggested that Ben Sira or one or two other texts might be Sadducean, and maybe they were particularly interested in wisdom literature or something like that. But we don't know.
We have a question from the audience.
Oh.
Willem VO, thank you for your question. Weren't the Sadducees a Hellenistic bunch of the different sects? Why would they have a problem with a logos representation?
Yeah, I mean, certainly they are the most Hellenistic, which is why it makes sense for this sort of Hellenistic aristocratic priest to be part of this, because the whole of the priesthood as aristocrats, they are the most assimilated to Hellenistic ways. They probably spoke Greek, they lived in these big mansions. They probably, they don't care about things like, I don't know, they think everybody can just make up their own mind. They think you have free will, because in their case, they have the ability to have free will. They're not slaves or anybody who doesn't, people with no money who have no option about what they do. So yes, they're certainly the most Hellenistic of them. They probably wouldn't have a problem with a logos representation. The problem is that the first time we have any indication that people are saying that Jesus is the logos is in John's Gospel, possibly late 1st century, even early 2nd century. So this is John's reflection on who Jesus is several decades later. I think where the Sadducees would have a problem is in somebody who comes to Jerusalem. He enters into the city on a donkey, mounted, to coming in for a pilgrimage feast on the back of a donkey is not the mark of a sort of a normal pilgrim. And then he goes into the temple and he does something there. He overturns the tables and the pigeon sellers. So I think that's what they had a problem with, not so much later Johannine thought.
Lucas Hunt, thank you for your question. Does high priest always come from Sadducees? What then is a chief priest or a Gamaliel?
Again, we don't know for sure that all the high priests come from the Sadducees, but it seems a reasonable assumption, again, because they're part of this aristocratic, Hellenistic, sort of very worldly sect. Chief priests is an interesting thing, because the chief priests as a group only start to exist in the time of Herod the Great, because back in the day, the high priesthood, of course, was hereditary and it was for life. So a man would have the high priesthood, and then when he died, either his son or his brother would take over from him, and it would continue like that. So there was only one high priest. What Herod did, though, was to start deposing high priests. Of course, there's precedent for this at sort of, just before the Maccabean war, the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century. But Herod decides that he's going to sort of appoint, depose high priests depending on sort of, who he likes the look of best. Or, he makes one guy high priest because he wants to marry his daughter, and he wants to give him a bit more status. So Herod could have any number of reasons as to why he appointed people. But then you get this really interesting situation in which you have ex-high priests. And what do you call them? It's clear from Josephus that actually they still just get called high priest, because, what else are you going to call them? Ex-high priest, former high priest. And so that seems to be the origin of this group of people that are called chief priests in the gospel, are probably the family of the high priest, specifically including people who have been deposed, former high priests. I mean, it's a little bit like, I suppose, the situation we have with the Pope at the moment. We have a Pope, but there's also a former Pope. And so, it could get a little bit complicated, the Pope emeritus and the current Pope. We had the same problem in Britain with the Queen. When Queen Elizabeth became Queen, her mother, who was also Queen Elizabeth, was still living, and so she was given the title Queen Mother. So you do get these sort of constitutional difficulties, I think, if you don't let what should be a hereditary thing run its course. So that's what the chief priests were. Gamaliel is just a person. I mean, he's a rabbi from the 1st century who supposedly Paul studied with, but he's one of the few rabbis that we know of from the 1st century, and there are some sayings ascribed to him in rabbinic writing. So he will have been a Pharisee, not a Sadducee.
There's another question about the Sadducees, and then I'll turn to my questions. John, do you pick up your question? Why did the Sadducees disappear if they were the most assimilated? Wouldn't they be the ones most likely?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think the reason was their whole sort of purpose was connected to the temple. So when the temple fell, they didn't have the same purpose. And also the Pharisees seem to have been the ones who were most liked by the people. So people seem to have respected the Pharisees and held them in high esteem, even if they didn't necessarily follow all of their ideas about purity and all the rest of it. People respected the Pharisees. So I think it's the combination of the temple being destroyed and the Pharisees sort of gaining in prestige at that point, and then sort of maneuvering themselves to being the main leaders of Judaism. I mean, I'm sure some Pharisees just sort of became incorporated into what later became rabbinic schools. So some of these Sadducean ideas probably continued in that way, but largely I think it's because the Sadducees were so connected to the temple that once that went, they didn't have the same sort of power base anymore.
Do all the 4 Gospels consistently tell us the same information or the same basic information about Caiaphas, or do they contradict each other on this?
Yeah, they're sort of subtly different. I wouldn't say they necessarily contradict. I mean, except insofar as, the trial accounts in each of the Gospels are slightly different, or quite a bit different, depending on sort of how much latitude you want to allow them. So I mean, Mark is quite interesting here in that he doesn't give Caiaphas's name. He just says the high priest. So without sort of Josephus or something like that, we wouldn't know who the high priest was. It's actually Matthew who fills in his name when he comes to rewrite Mark. But what Mark does, I think, is quite subtle. You might think this is over subtle. You might think I'm reading too much into this, but I think there's something here in that Mark has Mark has a sort of a Jewish trial and a Roman trial, and there's a lot of parallels between them. And the more you kind of look at these trials in detail, the more you see that they are kind of like two parallel stories. And in the Jewish trial, he says he just talks about the high priest. In the Roman trial, though, he just talks about Pilate. So in the Jewish trial, then we just have the office, but no mention of the man. In the Roman trial, we have mention of the man, but no reference to the office. So he doesn't say Pilate, the governor, or the prefect, or anything like that. And it might seem very subtle, but I think it does have the effect that in the Jewish trial, as I said before, he's sort of broadening responsibility for the death of Jesus to the Jews more broadly. So he has the elders of the people, the scribes, and by saying the high priest, he kind of gives it that authority, that formal nature. The high priest of the Jews has condemned Jesus, whereas in the Roman trial, although clearly Jesus has a trial and clearly he's condemned at the end and clearly he's sent off to execution, the fact that there he just says Pilate and doesn't say the Roman governor, he doesn't give him any kind of official title, I think sort of tends to put more the blame on that man. So, that man sent him away, but it leaves it open whether another Roman governor might have had a different view. And I think that again sort of ties in with Mark's ideas that Rome is not exonerated here. Rome clearly sent Jesus to the cross, but the greater responsibility for what happens is, he wants to say, is with the Jewish authorities. So Luke rewrites that in a very different way, and he again doesn't give Caiaphas his name, and he sort of rewrites this quite differently, but he does mention Caiaphas right at the beginning when he's sort of giving a time reference. He says, in the high priesthood of Caiaphas and Annas. And also they appear again in the beginning of Acts, where the early Christians are being arrested and hauled in front of councils and various high priestly groups. Again, he mentions Annas, the father-in-law, and Caiaphas there. Luke also has a slightly strange passage where he says that Paul received letters from the high priest, which allowed him to go and round up people belonging to the Christian faith. Now, whether that's historical or not, we don't really know. But if it is, then again, maybe that's Caiaphas. But of all the Gospels, actually, it's John's Gospel that seems to have the most interest in the high priesthood and has most to say about the high priesthood, because he is the one who has this sort of early trial in chapter 11 where Jesus isn't present, but the high priests get together with the Pharisees and they discuss it all. And the high priest then, who's specifically named as Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, he says, which has opened up the possibility that it was a yearly recurring thing, though I think he just means at that time. I don't think he means anything more than that. But Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, says, he says he prophesies that it's better for you that one man should die than that the whole nation should perish. And this idea of high priesthood and prophecy is actually one that you do find in Josephus too. It was sort of popularly believed that when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, this most sacred of days, where he went, the one day of the year where the high priest is allowed into the Holy of Holies, and he has to wear just a white tunic, none of his priestly regalia to go in there. And there was a tradition that, when he went into the presence of God, he might be given some sort of prophetic powers. So I think John knows quite a lot about sort of priestly circles. And then later on in his trial narrative, he has Caiaphas and or Annas, his father-in-law, interrogating Jesus before he's sent to Pilate. It's not very clear which of them is the one who interrogates Jesus, and maybe that's a deliberate thing that John wants us to kind of to imagine, that it's the high priest. It's kind of, again, the emphasis is on the office. It's the highest ranking Jew in the land who interrogates Jesus. And it's from John, of course, that we know that Caiaphas was married to Annas's daughter. It's not in any other gospel, and it's not even in Josephus, that little detail. So assuming it's correct, and there's no particular reason to imagine that John has invented it, that does kind of open up all sorts of other avenues about Caiaphas and his relationship to this priestly dynasty. So kind of subtle differences, but not massive, maybe.
So, how different would you say the historical Caiaphas is from the New Testament's portrayal of Caiaphas?
I think we just don't know. I mean, I think the problem is we just don't have enough. I mean, we can see how he's being used as a literary character in the Gospels. And I think it's always important to remember with the Gospels that we have, I mean, they're broadly kind of historical. I mean, they are about a person who clearly was sent to a Roman cross. But there's, they are written up to inspire faith, and that's particularly the case with the Passion narratives. So you wouldn't and none of the Gospel writers were likely to have been there in the room, and probably didn't have particularly good sources as to what was said, how the trial went, how it went. So this is a story, it's a biography. They're telling a story about a person that they want you to have faith in. Whereas Josephus really tells us very little about Caiaphas. We just hear vaguely bits and pieces about him, so that helps us to get together a timeline about him and one or two important points, but not too much more, really. I mean, I suppose the main similarity is the fact that what was really important for Caiaphas was working closely with Rome, keeping the Romans on side. I mean, people sometimes say, oh, he was a collaborator. And to some extent, though, you had to be, because, if he didn't do what Rome wanted, best case is that he gets deposed, somebody else gets his job. Worst case is that, the Romans send in troops to the temple. So, I mean, it's a difficult job. Like I said before, there's this tightrope that's got to be walked. And I think both the Gospels and Josephus sort of reflect that difficulty of navigating that role of being a high priestly Jewish aristocrat under Roman domination.
Got a couple of super chats. JM, thank you for your super chat and the thumbs up. Appreciate it. Lucas Hunt, thank you for your super chat. The fall of Jerusalem seems central to much of the Old Testament. Was a very Jewish literary response other than possibly the Gospels? I wonder if he
You
means
mean
I
you
wonder
mean
if
the
he
New
meant.
Testament?
Yes, that's what I was about to say.
Yeah. That's a really good question, because I absolutely think that the Gospels are a response to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So, and there is also, as you say, a strong Jewish literary response. So, Josephus itself is a literary response to the fall of Jerusalem. His first work, The Jewish War, is an attempt to try and explain how on earth did God allow, the God of the Jews, Yahweh, how did he allow the Romans to come and flatten the temple? How on earth can you get your head around that? And, he comes up with his own theological answers, because certain groups of the population had been doing the wrong thing. God decided he was going to chastise the nation. This is a very Old Testament Deuteronomistic interpretation. But, that's the only way he can make sense of this. There's various other Jewish texts as well that kind of are trying to sort of grapple with where are we now that we don't have a temple, and how do we explain it? But I think absolutely that the Gospels are part of that sort of Jewish movement, and part of it, and also perhaps, standing back and saying, well, actually, we have slightly different resources now. For Christians now, the central thing is no longer the temple, it's actually the person of Jesus. And I think it's probably no accident that we start to get biography or life writing after the fall of Jerusalem. So, whereas the temple was the central thing before, and perhaps the law, now for Christians, it's the person of Jesus. And And so I think this is very much a literary response, that sort of puts Jesus in the place where those other institutions were, but also perhaps to some extent kind of distances these early Christians from what's going on in the Jewish world, as they are also trying to make sense of who are we now that we no longer have a temple.
James Valiant, thank you for your question. But the Gospels are letting the Romans off the hook.
I don't think they let them off the hook completely. Like I said, I think, I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that Pilate is the one who eventually sends Jesus to the cross, even though the gospel writers, try to sort of muddy that a little bit. But I think the big thing there is that by the time you get the gospels written in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, it's clear that most of the people who are now joining the movement are coming from the Gentile world. So they're Romans, or they're other kinds of Gentiles. And that brings its own problems, because they might listen to Christianity. They like the idea. Yeah, I can go along with this teaching, this Jesus character. He seems nice, good sort of person to model your life on. But then you get to the difficulty. He was killed by Rome as he was executed as a state criminal, and that's very difficult. So I think the way that the Gospels sort of handle that is to put more and more blame on the Jewish side of things, and say, well, it was the Jews who really pushed for that, and Pilate didn't want to, or Pilate, he could have gone in a different direction, but he didn't in the end. So I think they're wanting to lessen the guilt of Pilate, even though in the end, they have to accept that it was Pilate, or because of Rome, that Jesus ended up on the cross. So I think they try to let the Romans off the hook as much as they can, because they know that this is good for the people who are now joining the movement. They don't want to join a movement that has a criminal at the center. And of course, for these Christians who are writing this, they don't believe that Jesus is a criminal anyway. So I think that's why you get this sort of slightly awkward sort of descriptions of the leading Jews and Pilate.
We have another super chat question. Brett Forsyth, thank you for your super chat. What do you make of James, a brother of Jesus, going into the Holy of Holies? Was he considered a high priest?
I can't remember. This is from one of those. Who was it? Papias or somebody like that, who says that he went into the Holy of Holies. I don't know. Maybe you could remind me. But it does suggest. I mean, I think, was it James, the brother of Jesus, or was it even John himself? Was it John, the evangelist, who's said to have gone into the Holy of Holies? Because there is a tradition that the author of John's Gospel was a high priest, or at least belonged to a priestly family. So I think it's the evangelist John who's supposed to have gone into the Holy of Holies, but I can't remember, was it Papias or somebody else who says that. And I think, I mean, again, there's no evidence that the author of John's Gospel was a priest, but if I had to put money on any of the evangelists being from a priestly background, it would be John, because, as I said, John does seem very interested in priesthood. He pays a lot more attention to Caiaphas and Annas than any of the others, and so. Yeah, I mean, it's possible. And then there's that strange reference to, the beloved disciple, or whoever it is, the disciple who was known to the high priest. So, is one of Jesus's disciples particularly known to the high priest? And what do we make of that? So I don't think there's any historical truth in it, but that I think there are traditions that that John has some kind of priestly background. I mean, you could just get it from the text. That's the thing, you could just read the text and say, oh, well, he seems to have an interest in priests, so maybe he was a priest, and then you've got your tradition. But I'm not sure that I'd necessarily think that there's much history there.
what can be reliably believed about Caiaphas's interaction with Jesus in the Gospels? How much of that is historical?
Yeah, I mean that's a difficult one. I mean, of course, there are people who say that there was no Jewish involvement whatsoever, that Jesus could have just been routinely picked up by the Romans, put on a cross, and even Pilate himself might not have been involved in anything. You know, he was in some sort of scuffle and got put on a cross, and I mean, you know, we shouldn't underestimate the low value given to human life at the time, particularly somebody like Jesus, who's just a provincial. You know, he's a man of no status. He's not a citizen or anything like that. But I do think that there was some level of involvement by Caiaphas and the other high priests, and there's two reasons for saying that. One is that in that paragraph in Josephus, you know, the Testimonium Flavianum, where Josephus talks about Jesus. Now, clearly, it has been heavily edited by later Christians. There's no doubt about that at all. And maybe they've taken bits out as well. I'm sure there's some kind of turmoil, tumult, or something in there that they've just taken out as well. But I think there is something there. There was something there that Josephus wrote, and I think when you when you take out the obviously the obviously later Christian bits, the reference to Jesus being handed over by the leading men amongst us does kind of sound vaguely Josephine, and you know, is a sort of thing that he might well have said. And so I would sort of tend to trust that as being part of Josephus's original. Also, you would expect, if it had originated in sort of the 3rd century or whenever it was that these Christian interpolations date from, you would expect it to be much more hostile to Jews, because by that time, you know, Christian writing did tend to be quite hostile. So the fact that it's fairly matter of fact makes me think that maybe it does go back to Josephus's original. And the second reason for thinking that there may well have been some high priestly involvement is the story of Jesus ben Ananias, who is this sort of prophetic character who appears in the 60s. And he's on the temple, and he's prophesying the destruction of the temple. He keeps saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa," and he doesn't have a following or anything like that. But people just get sick of him. You know, he's sort of, you can imagine you would get pretty sick. And so in that case, the chief priests go to the Roman governor, Albinus, and they say that they tell him about this guy, and they say, you know, we need to get rid of him. And Albinus brings him in. He listens to him. He decides he's mad and just sends him back again. And at which point he carries on in the temple with what he was doing before. But so it's a slightly different story, slightly different outcome. That second Jesus doesn't get killed, at least not by the Roman governor. But I think, you know, in terms of how things work, it's the chief priests who are annoyed by him. They want him got rid of. They report him to the governor. The governor has some kind of a brief hearing, and then decides what he's going to do with him. So I think that's a very similar chain of events to what we probably have underlying the story of Jesus of Nazareth. That, again, because the chief priests are interested in keeping the peace, you know, this is the festival. This is the most important thing for them. This is the biggest pilgrimage festival of the year. There's hundreds of people, thousands of people in Jerusalem. They're all pushed in together. Jesus, like I said, has made this kind of entry. He said, "Hey, you know, I'm here." And then he's gone into the temple, and he's performed this sort of symbolic act. And, you know, it didn't matter what it symbolized. From the high priest's point of view, they must have been thinking, what comes next? What's his next move? And, you know, Christians tend to kind of assume that the chief priests were all these real bad guys, self-serving, and, you know, just depraved and only interested in what they can get out of things. But But I think we can be a little bit more positive towards them. If their whole rationale is to make sure that the feast runs smoothly, that the laws of God are followed in the Passover, and they would know that if Jesus did anything else during the feast, that particularly if he was in the temple, that that risked Romans coming. The Romans were on the portico of the temple looking for trouble, so that they could very easily just come down, swoop into action, and there could be bloodshed in the temple. They could stop the feast. So I think there's many reasons why the Jewish chief priests would have been just as interested in making sure that there was no trouble at Passover as the Roman governor.
And by the way, it was Epiphanius and Jerome that mentioned that James.
Oh, it was
entered-
James, was it? Oh, right. Sorry.
Jerome and Epiphanius. Yeah.
Right. Well,
Uh,
I mean that is then an interesting thing, because it brings obviously Jesus into this priestly family, and Luke, of course, has already made links with Levites and the priesthood in terms of John the Baptist being related to, or at least his Elizabeth and Mary being related. But thank you.
John D., thank you for your question. Does Dr. Bond think James was an important enough figure in Jerusalem that his execution caused upset, or was it just about abuse of power by the priest?
And you're talking about James rather than Jesus. Yeah, I mean, James is an interesting one, because in the case of James, they wait until there's a sort of a bit of a power vacuum amongst the Roman governor at the time. I forget which one was Albinus had gone, and they were just waiting for the new governor to come. And so there's sort of a few months sort of between them. So so the high priest decides he's going to act against James and execute him. So yeah, I mean, clearly James does seem to be a particular kind of, he's very he's clearly law observant. I mean, we know that from Paul's letters as well. So it may well be that there was some kind of trouble, even with somebody like James. It's just difficult to know sort of what the high priests would specifically have had against somebody like James, particularly since before the fall of Jerusalem, of course, there's all sorts of different ways of being Jewish. You can be a Pharisee, a Sadducee, and a Essene, all of these different things. So Christianity, if we can call it that, Christ following, is just another way of being Jewish at the time. But I mean, we don't actually know. It might be because of his Christian commitment, but it might equally be because he has a lot of authority. Maybe he has a following. Maybe it's more to do with power and things like that made the high priest want to get rid of him. It's yeah. We don't have enough information. That's the problem.
Yeah, it was Porcius Festus that was gone, and Albinus was on his way to come in.
Ah, right. Okay. So this is before the Jesus Ben Ananias incident.
As the governor, not high priest, excuse me.
Yeah.
So do you think that if there's anything that we can know about Caiaphas's role in the death of Jesus, do you think he may have at least been involved in maybe handing him over? Maybe kind of like that the testimony implied that the leaders handed them over, or
yeah, I think that's likely, that there was a sort of a nod and a wink, and because I mean, because that is how power and things like that happened in the first century. I mean, Pilate would obviously have had spies and informers. He had Herod Antipas there. Jesus's activity was very close to in Antipas's territory. So there would have been plenty of people who would already have told Pilate something about Jesus. And, maybe his card was already marked. Maybe Pilate was, again, just waiting for an opportunity to get rid of him anyway. But I think it seems quite likely to me that the Jewish chief priests also had their own reasons to want to get rid of him, and maybe maybe they thought that if we sort of hand him over, then maybe we'll get something in return from Pilate, because it's quite a big thing for Jews to hand over one of their own, particularly somebody who at least some people are seeing as a prophet. But of course, these chief priests would have just thought that he was a false prophet, that he was misguided, and perhaps they just hoped that Pilate would do something for them in the future.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Helen Bond.
Thank you very much, and thanks to people for their questions.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.